people who fought in the First World War were horrified at what had happened, the ridiculous casualties, and so they were determined, that generation, it wasn't going to happen again.
You could lose 60,000 dead in a few days fighting in the First World War for no result at all. In the Second World War, they captured the whole of Western Europe for 60,000 dead.
The Germans were in that unique position of having produced a force at the beginning of a war which was absolutely viable and nothing to oppose it.
The Maginot Line, a series of fortresses stretching 400 miles from the Swiss Alps to the Belgian frontier. In chambers buried deep underground, over 200,000 French soldiers lived, ate, and slept here. Many fought and died here. Most waited for an attack that never came. It was the most imposing string of fortifications ever built, and at the time, they thought it impregnable. It was the concept of the World War I trench taken to the extreme, a monument to lessons learned from the Great War that bankrupted a continent of its youth. In the bloody trenches of World War I, over 15 million men died along a stagnant front that, after 4 years of carnage, had, in places, moved only yards.
It was these wave formations which presented the machine gunners on the opposite side with their targets, and which accounted for the quite extraordinary casualties that were suffered. Literally hundreds and hundreds of British soldiers from the same battalion or brigade were killed or wounded without ever having left their own front line, without ever having crossed their own front line.
You see, the people who fought in the First World War were horrified at what had happened, the ridiculous casualties, appalling casualties, and the mismanagement that went on in general on both sides of the line. No question about this at all. And so they were determined, that generation, it wasn't going to happen again.
Everybody was obsessed since the First World War with how to break through a front. How did you do it? How did you do it? You couldn't do it with infantry, you couldn't do it with artillery, you couldn't do it with infantry and artillery, so maybe the tank could do it. That was the solution.
Early tanks inspired little confidence in military circles, but one irreverent British Army major saw in these cumbersome land battleships an answer to the deadly stalemate of trench warfare. His name was J.F.C. Fuller.
He was a dynamic man, enormous ideas, terrific ideas, couldn't care less about authority, and he would let fly with an acerbic wit. But he was a creative genius, and began developing the idea of deep penetration with tanks, where you go deep, straight through the enemy lines, get into his rear areas, disrupt his communications, destroy his headquarters, interrupt the supplies coming through, and generally strike fear right through the enemy lines, so you produce paralysis.
Defeat had left the German General Staff of the 1920s open to new ideas. Their architect for this new kind of warfare was General Heinz Guderian.
My father was certainly the most important man for the German Tank Corps. He seized upon the idea. He conceived the idea, translated the idea into action, built up the German Tank Corps, and he then had the good fortune to have his idea proven correct.
And Guderian was interesting in the fact that he'd like to consider defeat as a basis for learning things, whereas a lot of generals tend to look at victories as a way of looking at it. He looked at defeat and sought ways to overcome it. And mechanization, all arms formations, these sort of things were all a way of doing it and combining it with air power. And all these people were sitting together, working out these ideas during the 20s and 30s, and they got it right. It is very unusual, but they got it right.
At the same time, another revolution, also born in the aftermath of the Great War, had come of age, led by a brooding figure promising the restoration of order and pride to an embittered people.
Hitler, who was after quick solutions and almost propaganda stuff in a way, saw in the Air Force and saw in the tank force the chance to do these things, and therefore he gave them that encouragement and priority which enabled them to develop the way they did.
At first we couldn't do anything in Germany. All we could do was to think about what we were going to do. Then we secretly built a few tanks and tried them out, along with the Russians. But it was not until after 1933, after the Versailles Treaty had been eliminated, that we could really start in earnest.
For the first time, after the end of World War I, we had found again our self-confidence. We knew that we could handle our problems and that we were a united people again.
With the death of the aging Chancellor Hindenburg in 1933, Hitler's ascension to power was complete. His vision of a Third Reich and Guderian's of a modern Panzer army were about to meet at a crossroads in history that would lead to a new European Holocaust.
Hitler, who had been a very brave soldier in the First World War, who'd taken part in 25 trench battles, who'd been 3 times wounded, and was determined that the unjust result of the First World War must be reversed. I look for no other explanation of the Second World War than that. There are all sorts of diplomatic and economic and social explanations of the First World War. I don't think any of them stand up to this personal obsession of Hitler's, which expressed also the rancors and hatreds and disappointments of his generation. Why did over 2 million Germans die for nothing?
By the mid-30s, Hitler demanded and received an oath of allegiance from the Wehrmacht. In return, he promised them renewed strength and a restoration of territories lost after World War I.
Adolf Hitler!
Well, first there were reservations. There's a letter of my father's regarding the swearing in to Hitler, where he wrote, "We have now sworn allegiance to Hitler. That is a grave oath. The army is accustomed to keeping its word. Let us hope it will be able to do so honorably." Later, however, Hitler's successes convinced all Germans. Unemployment disappeared. There was no more domestic fighting. And then his foreign policy successes, they were truly magnificent. The annexation of Austria, the Sudetenland. We were all very happy about that. The invasion of Prague then was somewhat sticky, because that was equivalent to breaking a given promise. He had said earlier, we don't want any Czechs. And then, suddenly, half a year later, his troops marched through Prague. That was certainly frightening, but people were still believing things would come to a good end after all.
Publicly, Hitler proclaimed, "I am insulted by the assertion that I want war. Am I a fool? It would settle nothing." Privately, battle plans were issued for the attack on Poland, whose very existence reflected Germany's humiliation in World War I. Spearheading the attack would be Guderian's panzers. Close behind, SS units, ordered to kill without mercy all men, women, and children of the Polish race. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's vision of a Reich to last 1,000 years was launched. In an orchestration of infantry, armor, and air power, nearly 2 million German troops swept into Poland. They called it Blitzkrieg, and one soldier wrote, "It is a wonderful feeling now to be German. A quarter of an hour now, and the row of tanks has no end.
I think when the Second World War broke out, everybody thought it would, to some extent, follow the same pattern as the First World War. Everybody would jump back in their trenches again where they left off in 1918 and start the whole thing over again. But, of course, that wasn't the German intention to allow that to happen, you see.
Germany's intention was to regain the Polish corridor, a strip of land ceded to Poland by the Treaty of Versailles, splitting East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Poles, fearing attack, had wanted to fully mobilize their army, but were dissuaded by Western powers, fearful of provoking Hitler.
The Germans surrounded the Poles on three sides before the war began, and the Poles' strategy was to defend Poland as far westwards as possible. So in a sense, they'd handed victory to the Germans on a plate, because all the Germans had to do was march in behind them from north and south and cut them off, and that's what they did.
A number of Hitler's generals sought only the restoration of pre-World War I Germany, but elation over the lightning success of the Polish campaign tempered their caution. Soon events were escalating out of control as the ambitions of the Führer became clear.
The campaign in Poland then was the last element of the Treaty of Versailles that was supposed to be taken out by the elimination of that corridor. We had no idea that Hitler always had or may have had ulterior motives. Then we were forced to wage war. Once we had started the campaign against Poland, the English and the French declared war on us, and now we had to fight them. We were prepared for one war in Poland. In essence, we weren't even prepared for the war in the West, and certainly not at all for a speedy war against the English, and least of all for a world war.
16 days after the German invasion, Soviet forces moved into Poland's eastern frontier. With cunning foresight, Hitler had made a pact with Stalin and struck the balance between aggression and diplomacy, so historically vital to Germany, an island in the center of Europe.
Of course, in 1939, they were not fighting on two fronts, or in 1940. That was a remarkable thing. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the German officers admired Hitler. Of course, they wouldn't publicly say that they admired him, but they admired his diplomacy because he arranged things so that they only had to fight in 1939 in the east, and then in 1940 they could fight in the west again on one front. I don't think at that stage that the mobility of the tank was as important as the diplomacy of the war.
Throughout the coldest winter in a century, the men of both sides sat it out in what was soon called the phony war. But as British troops wrote home about splendid French wines, the German general staff worked on refining the tactics that had brought them victory in Poland. The boldness of the German plan was stunning. It called for a diversionary attack in the north. Once this drew in French and British forces, they would launch their main thrust through the Ardennes and Sedan in the south. Marking the northernmost tip of the Maginot Line, and defended by just a thin line of pillboxes along the Meuse River, the rambling, thickly wooded Ardennes was seen by both French and British as impassable to armor. On May the 10th, 1940, all lay ready.
When Guderian and the other Germans planned to cross the river at Sedan, not even they believed it completely. But the fact of the matter was the attack could be mounted at terrific speed, and would happen much earlier than many Germans thought it would. And having got to the river, they knew they were hitting a thinner spot. Their intelligence told them this, so they had an advantage there. And then you begin to get then the idea of the marvellous flexibility of a panzer force, where you have all arms there, you had infantry going across in boats under artillery support, you had the high-velocity anti-tank, anti-aircraft guns and anti-tank guns firing at the pillbox slits that you can see along the roadsides there, and knocking them out. And that enables the infantry to go across almost untouched, get on the ground the other side, open out the bridgehead at last light. Don't forget this attack took place towards the end of the afternoon. Then during the night, the bridges can be built across the river, the rafts put in place, and the first of the armour moved across, so that at dawn next day you had the perfect breakout with the all-arms force led by tanks.
What happened commonly down on the Ardennes front on May the 10th, May the 11th, 1940, when Guderian's and Kleist's panzers started to come through, was that the French would actually begin to run away before they'd ever seen a tank. The tank acquired a sort of mythic quality overnight, and people would say tanks, and you knew, or at least they thought they knew, that they were going to get beaten and they'd better leg it immediately. And that's what they did.
Basically because they were demoralised from the word go. They'd had enough of war. That's the real fundamental thing. The whole nation collapsed. It wasn't just the army. But also, of course, they had gone for this linear concept on Maginot Line and things like that. The armoured forces they developed were not anything like as well commanded and controlled. The system wasn't anything like as good as the German one. They were completely outmanoeuvred.
French armor was actually more numerous and more powerful than the Wehrmacht's, but their crews were ill-trained in mobile tactics and widely dispersed along a 400-mile front.
On the whole, we got the feeling that they were not convinced of their cause. That was a striking difference to us. You know, they did their duty, but only up to a certain point. And then, when it was possible not to lose face, they gave up.
Unlike the conscripts of France, the British Army of 1940 was a professional organization of hand-picked men to whom defeat was an impossible notion.
We had to bring back a group of British prisoners. All these guys, they had to fall in line, they snapped to attention, they started marching, and shortly thereafter started singing. It is a long way to Tipperary. You know, we felt enthusiastic about it. We said, God damn it, these are soldiers, real soldiers.
We felt that we would make a stand somewhere and things would build up again and we'd have another go and perhaps be more successful next time. We had no idea we were going to be forced out of France. No idea at all.
On May 20th, German radio broadcast a chilling proclamation. People of France, cease thinking the world is with you. It is overwhelmingly ours.
In the West, we attempted to continue advancing day and night once we had started moving, and not to make any stops. And in order to allow us to do that, we had with us pills, pervitin as it was called, to keep us awake. So I believe, especially in the West, where we knew that it was all about moving forward as fast as possible, we were prepared to function day and night.
By May 24th, Guderian's armored columns were within sight of the Channel coast. Utterly broken, French Premier Paul Renault lamented, "We have gone to war with a 1918 army against a German army of 1939. This war is sheer madness." In its wake, the German Panzer spearhead left enemy communications and supply lines in ruin. The Allied command structure was completely paralyzed, just as Fuller and Guderian predicted.
The key to it was the command and control system of the superior radios which the Germans had. And our radios and the French radios were not in such profusion, nor were they so good. So the breakthrough, you can argue here, was in radio technology. Electronics.
German advantages went well beyond those of command and control. The Germans also possessed the most lethal anti-tank gun of the war.
That's the 2-pounder that we had in France and right up to May 1942 on the desert, another 2 years. And this is the chap, the 88mm, that was the best anti-tank gun of the whole war. It was a formidable weapon.
5 or 6 light British tanks drove up, one in a row, one after the other. we were able to get support from a German 8.8 gun, and one after the other, those light British tanks were virtually blown off the road.
Occasionally an odd man would come scrambling out. He was probably burnt or wounded, but most of the men were killed inside. Some pretty horrible things happen inside a tank when it's hit by an anti-tank gun, especially of that caliber.
It was beyond comprehension, the sadness and the sorrow and the horror of looking in and seeing somebody that you've been talking to a few moments ago, and now they were absolutely shattered. And also the fact of fear, because fear is still there. You're probably still within range of the enemy, and what has happened to him could happen to you next. So the fear mingles with it, the comradeship, the loss. It's like going to a normal funeral and reinforcing that emotion 100 times, and all happening very, very quickly, because in a moment or so you have to leave him, and you have to go away, you have to desert him.
I mean, once you are fighting a war, you are fighting a war. Later on, I mean, it is high in vogue to say, oh, by golly, I nearly wept when I knew about these guys. I didn't weep like nearly all other soldiers didn't either. I surely felt sad when I knew here 5 guys my age have to burn in this goddamn tank now, naturally. In the same way I felt sad when I saw chums of mine in the neighboring car were burning off, but that doesn't make any difference.
The tank is a convenient, sanitized way of killing people. It's a sort of a humane killer, and you don't get the sense of blood, of suffering, of people screaming. If someone screams outside, you don't hear it because the noise inside the tank is so tremendous.
But in their race to the coast, German columns were usually ordered to bypass enemy strongpoints. And by May 25th, they had accomplished the impossible, trapping nearly 400,000 British and French troops at the seaside town of Dunkirk. Then suddenly, almost in disbelief of their apparent victory, they stopped.
And because they slowed down and because they stopped, it gave it time to open the sluice gates and flood the marshes around Dunkirk and to set up a bridgehead, as a result of which what was known as the miracle of Dunkirk occurred. And all those soldiers, without their equipment, but at least the soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them, were rescued in the most astonishing way by the Royal Navy and yachtsmen and fishermen, and got them off, which would never have happened if the panzer divisions had gone to the beaches at Dunkirk, which they should have done, and would have done if Hitler hadn't lost his nerve.
The Germans were in that unique position of having produced a force at the beginning of a war which was absolutely viable. And it's very rare. Normally, all sides fight with the ideas of the old war and develop it. On this occasion, you had someone who was right ahead and nothing to oppose it.
You could lose 60,000 dead in a few days fighting in the First World War for no result at all. In the Second World War, they captured the whole of Western Europe in a few weeks, in 60 days, for 60,000 dead.
What they did right, I think, really, was boldly to absolutely go hell for leather for the coast. It was a terribly bold thing to do. If the French had assembled enough of their armour together, then they would have cut off those panzer divisions. They'd have been ahead without a body. But they took that risk, and it was a bold thing to do, and that's what was right.
With dreams of a lifetime fulfilled, a triumphant Hitler toured Paris. A day later, he was heralded into Berlin as the greatest hero since Bismarck. With a smaller force, his troops had achieved a victory of unparalleled proportion, but the cost would be high. Because if the German blitzkrieg had finally made right the injustices of World War I, it also unleashed the butchery of that war and set it into motion. In the next 5 years, twice as many civilians would perish as would soldiers of the armies meant to protect them. By war's end, over 40 million would die.